Okay, so here we're going to talk about avalanche terrain identification for motorized users. At this point, you guys are all familiar with the avalanche triangle, and terrain plays a very key role in that. And what's awesome about terrain is that it's something we get to pick and choose what we're in and how we want to mitigate our exposure. Some basic terminology for an avalanche path is you have your start zone, your track, and your run out. Your start zone is where avalanches often start. Your track is the main path of the avalanche path, and the run out is where, in a large avalanche, the debris ends up. This is a very plain and simple avalanche path, very large and easy to identify all the parts. But as we move through avalanche terrain, we're not just exposing ourselves to one path. We have a complex environment. And so there will be multiple starting zones, multiple tracks, and multiple run-out zones. And that's a lot to handle, especially as a motorized user when you're traveling so much faster than a non-motorized user. If we want to make it more basic and black and white, really, it doesn't matter if it's the starting zone, the track, or the run out. You only want to be exposing one person to hazard at a time. That being said, you have to think a lot about where you're regrouping. So if all those areas were red, we don't want to expose more than one person at a time. Your regrouping areas need to be out of an avalanche path in safe zones. And it's really hard as a motorized user because we don't have the ease of communicating like non-motorized users do as they travel. So regrouping areas are very important for us as far as communication goes, but also the location in which we choose to do it is super important. It's hard to dig up your partner if you are also buried in an avalanche. So again, only exposing one person to a path at a time. Some terrain basics we're going to go over. We're going to talk about the slope angle, slope size, vegetation, slope shape, aspect, elevation, and consequences. So slope angle, very simple, very important. Most avalanches occur between 30 and 45 degrees. And, that's where we often like to recreate. Less than 30 degrees are often not steep enough to slide. Now, that doesn't mean they don't slide, but they are less often. And anything over 45 degrees, slabs are less common to form there because the snow is constantly shedding off those steeper slopes. Now, it's always important to realize not only what the slope angle is that you yourself are currently standing on, but what your slope is connected to. So most avalanches occur in that 30 to 45 degree slope angle, right? So that's your starting zone, things like that. But you have to think about the gentler terrain that you are also connected to. Or if you're standing below in the avalanche run out zone, what you're exposing yourself to that's above. Some simple ways to identify a slope angle. There's an inclinometer tool, very basic, very handy, and very important to use in the field. Here's an old school example of one. There's lots made. It doesn't really matter what brand. It's important to have one. You can also use maps or mapping apps. And it's important to understand the limitations of these apps as you're traveling. They're a great planning tool, but they're not always the best in the moment. Like you need to know what you yourself are standing on or riding on in that moment. Avalanche size. So avalanches come in all shapes and sizes. You can have little gullies, giant mountain faces, or just large paths. And needless to say, the volume of snow really directly relates to the consequences. So, you can increase your volume of snow, whether you extend the width of your avalanche or the depth of the snowpack that is avalanching. So it doesn't have to be a giant slope if the snowpack that's sliding is deep. That's still a large volume of snow. And if we want to break it down and make it more simple, what we're most concerned about are avalanches that are large enough to hurt, bury, or kill us. And we as humans and riders, we're not that big when it comes to a mountain or a slope. So we are concerned about any avalanche that's big enough to cause significant consequences to us. So again, something to think about. It could be a small road cut. It doesn't have to be a giant mountain face. So there are terrain traps is a term that you'll often hear, and it's just places where there's an increased consequence of getting caught or buried in them. So transitions, sharp transitions like a road cut or a sharp transition off of a slope face down to the flats, that's an increased deposition of snow. Trees and cliffs create their own hazards through trauma. So these are important things to think about when identifying and moving through avalanche terrain. Forested terrain comes with its own complications. Needless to say, there's a significant increase in the potential for trauma while traveling in forested terrain. And if you can ride through the timber, those trees are not anchoring that snow to that slope. So if you're riding through it, you're still in avalanche terrain. So don't let your guard down. And as you're traveling through forested terrain, you can look at trees and you see this what's called flagging. And that's where limbs have been broken off a side of a tree as past avalanches have come through. So that's a nice red flag for yourself to think about, oh, I am in an avalanche path. What part of the avalanche path am I in? And where do I need to go to be out of this hazard? Moving on to slope shape. So convexities and concavities. Convexities, often called rollovers, the slab is being stressed as it's put or wrapping over the convexity. And so it's often where avalanches start. A concavity is where you can have an increased deposition of snow. So a terrain trap. So both places to watch out for different reasons. A convexity is a very good starting zone. A concavity is a very good terrain trap. Just an old school photo here of you have your convexity at the top and your terrain trap or gully at the bottom. So the avalanche obviously started up there on the convexity and it came through, traveled down to this terrain trap and gully where you would have an increased deposition of snow. Aspect as it relates to wind. So, we spend time in the mountains, wind's obviously a part of it, and wind can transport snow 10 times faster than a precipitation can drop it. So it's really important because wind shapes how our snowpack looks. So you have your windward side, which is where the wind is coming from, and it's often scouring that slope. Then you have your lee side, where all that snow from the windward side is deposited, creating a much deeper snowpack. Other things you'll see on the leeward side are, if you're on a ridge top, are these cornices. And cornices are wave-like formations of snow over the break. Cornices are very sensitive and they can break very far back. So it's something to be very, very watchful of when you're traveling on ridge tops. Below a cornice, you're going to have what's called a pillow. And a pillow is just wind-deposited snow right beneath the cornice. And it's sensitive and can easily trigger avalanches. So as you're traveling through the mountains, be curious where the snow has transported as you come across scoured slope. As you can see in this photo here, you can see the prevailing winds coming from the left to the right and how it's scouring off those slopes and depositing all that snow onto the other slopes. So think about how much deeper that snowpack is and the structure of it as you're traveling around. Aspect as it relates to the sun. So shadier aspects which would be your more northerly aspects, they're often cooler, softer snow, and can have more persistent instabilities due to the longer duration of snow cover. Contrastly, your sunnier aspects, your more southerly aspects, are typically warmer, have more crusts, shallower, and are prone to wet, loose avalanches. So what that looks like in real life here, this is a southerly slope on a warming day, and you can see all these little loose, wet avalanches occurring. So these are things to pay attention to as you're traveling through that identified avalanche terrain. Elevation. So higher elevations are often colder, snowier, and windier, but that doesn't mean that avalanches only occur there. Avalanches can occur in all three of these elevation bands, but they each present their own different, unique consequences. So more snow, windier, up and high, but below tree line, you're dealing with trees. And as we talked about earlier, they can be terrain traps. So it's often easy to identify avalanche terrain when you have the whole picture, like this giant avalanche path. You can see it, you can identify all the parts of it, but that's not what we experience as we're traveling through. This is the perspective that you're seeing as you're riding through the terrain. So what you constantly need to be asking yourself is this terrain that I'm in capable of producing an avalanche? And if so, what would the consequences be if one did occur? So constantly be reassessing your terrain choices, your location, and what consequences you're exposing yourself to. It's important to remember that there's a pattern of avalanches in relation to avalanche terrain. So think about the slope angle, the aspect, and the elevation. And as we want to keep it simple, you want to constantly be identifying the avalanche terrain, manage your exposure, minimize the time spent in, adjacent, and below avalanche paths, and that includes regrouping times, and always ask yourself, is this terrain capable of producing an avalanche? What are the consequences of an avalanche here? And what can we do to mitigate our exposure to the hazards? Again, we'd like you to all sign up for the daily GNFAC Avalanche Advisory, and we'll see you on the next video. Thanks.